So yesterday, we finished off chapter 8, which is about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. We had derived the short-run aggregate supply curve as an upward sloping relationship. We had plotted that positive relationship by essentially adjusting aggregate demand, keeping nominal wages fixed, allowing prices to adjust, and then essentially just moving up and down our labor demand curve. And that movement along that labor demand curve led to movements along the aggregate supply curve. We then, where's this thing? There we go. We then took a look at using our aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, bringing it together and shifting aggregate demand and aggregate supply around in response to one another. We plotted this real business cycle relationship. In other words, sometimes we're above our potential, sometimes we're below potential. Unemployment either increases or decreases. And we get this, over time, potentially cyclical movement. What we're going to do today is just build on that model, that aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, to talk more about inflation and unemployment in relation to that business cycle phenomenon. Okay, so we're doing chapter 29. What are we going to do? Distinguish between, we've got demand pull and we've got cost push inflation. So two different types of inflation. One, demand pull, two, cost push. We're going to illustrate both of these. We'll show them diagrammatically. In other words, we'll illustrate them graphically. We're going to explain how these occur. So how demand pull and cost push forces bring cycles in inflation and output. Okay, so we'll show how cost push and demand pull inflation occur and the link between that inflation and output, and we'll see how that's connected to our idea of a cycle. We're going to explain the short run and the long run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In other words, if there is an apparent link between inflation and output, that gives us some suggestion that there's going to be a link between inflation and unemployment. Okay? What is that link? We're going to diagrammatically show that link in something called the Phillips curve. So we're going to illustrate and interpret that Phillips curve. And we're going to see that there's a short run relationship and a long run relationship. This short run and long run relationship is related to our short run and our long run aggregate supply curve. And in fact, the relationships in the short run Phillips curve are derived basically from the short run aggregate supply curve, and the relationship in the long run Phillips curve is derived from the long run aggregate supply curve. Then we're going to explain how mainstream business cycle theory and real business cycle theory account for these essentially cyclical fluctuations in output and employment. Okay, so that's our mission for this chapter. And let's begin. Our two types of inflation. Number one, demand pull inflation. What do we mean by that? Well, when there's a shift or a change in demand, that triggers inflation. So inflation that starts because aggregate demand increases. So what happens? We have a shift to the right in our aggregate demand curve. Okay? If we look at our initial equilibrium position and we compare it to our new shifted aggregate demand curve, what do we see? Well, we've got a shortage in supply. In other words, our quantity demanded is greater than our quantity supplied. What is the mechanism within a market that restores equilibrium? Well, that puts upward pressure on prices. When the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, we have upward pressure on prices. As the price increases, We have a movement to the left along our new aggregate demand curve and a movement to the right along our new aggregate supply curve, and we arrive at a new point of equilibrium where our aggregate supply curve and our new aggregate demand curve intersect. How do we characterize that new point of equilibrium? Well, we have a higher level of output, okay, but we also have a higher price level. So technically, just an increase in prices doesn't constitute inflation in terms of our definition of inflation. Remember, inflation is supposed to be something that's ongoing, right? We often just use that increase in prices as a shorthand for just saying, well, therefore we've got inflation. Technically, it would need to be sustained over a period of time. And in fact, we'll see that if our aggregate demand curve shifts to the right and we have responses to that, well, we might well have, in fact, a technical definition of inflation, which is to say prices increasing continuously. And that would be our demand pull inflation. So what happens? Our aggregate demand increases. We've moved upwards to the right along our aggregate supply curve, but we know that because we've moved away from the long run aggregate supply curve, our new point of equilibrium, let's call this new point of equilibrium point 2. So we were at point 1, we've moved to point 2. At point 2, what do we know about equilibrium in the labor market? Are we at a point of equilibrium in the labor market at point 2? Are we at a point where labor demand and labor supply intersect? In the short run at point 2. Okay, let's go back to what our diagram looked like, although it is a little bit of a mess. I'll just zoom in I'll just zoom in a bit. Oh man. Okay, now when I add this other layer, it's going to get a bit messy, but remember what happens with the blue lines, right? How do we move upwards along the aggregate supply curve? By moving down the labor demand curve without any change in labor supply, and we move away from that point of equilibrium, right? Are you with me or not really? Okay, are you not with me because you weren't here for the lecture, or are you not with me because you don't remember the lecture? Sorry? Yeah? I'm with you. Just follow the blue, right? So we're just focusing on the blue lines. Okay? Do I need to redraw this? No. Okay? Would anyone like me to redraw this? Let me do it quickly. Okay? How do we move away from equilibrium, or how do we move along an aggregate supply curve? If our aggregate demand shifts, we assume that nominal wages are sticky. With that increase in aggregate demand, we have upward pressure on prices. As prices start increasing with nominal wages fixed, if prices are increasing, what happens to real wages? Real wages fall. But remember, our labor supply curve is based on what the market, the employees in the labor market expect about nominal wages and prices. If they do not realize that prices are falling and they're only looking at nominal wages, which are remaining unchanged, that decrease in real wages is misinterpreted. Okay? Employees do not realize that real wages are decreasing, and because they do not realize that real wages are increasing, when employees want to hire more laborers, they are able to hire more laborers at the same nominal wage rate, and therefore a lower real wage rate, because employees do not realize prices have increased and that real wages have in fact decreased. Because remember, even at full employment, we still have unemployed people. So it is possible for employers to employ more people without changing the nominal wage rate, as long as employees do not realize that prices have changed or are not able to adjust for those prices. Right? So that increase in labor, what happens? Sorry, that increase in labor employed, so L1, increase in labor employed to L1 leads to an increase in output from Y0 to Y1. What happens? Well, we've got an increase in output from Y0 to, well, our prices have increased to a new point of equilibrium, Y1 at a higher price level, P1. With those higher prices, we are essentially at a lower real wage, WR1, which is equal to our initial nominal wage, WN0, divided by now higher P1. So P1 is greater than P0, therefore WR1 is less than WR0. Okay, so that's a brief recap of what we discussed, maybe not yesterday, but the day before, and similarly we did discuss something about it yesterday. Okay, so we move to position of equilibrium 2. What then moves us away from point 2? How do we restore equilibrium? In our diagram, how do we restore equilibrium? Once employees realize that prices have changed, what do they do when they go back to the negotiations table? They demand higher nominal wages, right? So nominal wages start increasing. Once nominal wages, so when WN0 starts increasing, okay, and we get we increase it to say WN2, okay. Where does WN2 end put us? Well, wages will increase until nominal wages will increase until real wages are restored. In other words, as nominal wages increase, so real wages increase. As real wages increase, we have a movement to the left along our labor demand curve. Our aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. In other words, at any given price level, less labor is supplied. We shift from AS0 to AS1. We return to our initial equilibrium level of output, Y0, but we're at a higher price level, P2, right? That movement along the labor demand curve obviously results in less people being employed and lower output. Okay, so once again, just a brief recap of the things that we discussed previously. Okay, so now we're illustrating from point 2, how do we arrive back at equilibrium? Well, our aggregate supply curve shifts to the left to restore equilibrium, right? So when we have demand pull inflation moving from point 1 to point 2, what is the response? Well, there will be a money wage rate response. The money wage rate begins to rise, and the short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left or decreases, which then prompts a further price rise. So our prices initially increased in our diagram from 110 to 113. Now with our supply response, we're going from 113 up to 121. There's a further price increase. So our initial increase in aggregate demand raised prices, but then the supply side response raises prices even more. Okay? So we refer to this as a demand pull inflation process. For inflation to then proceed, aggregate demand must persistently increase, and the only way it can do so is if the quantity of money persistently increases. So that is a theoretical explanation. Oops. So that's one of our theories, a theory of how inflation occurs. An increase in money which shifts aggregate demand then has an aggregate supply curve response, and as long as money is consistently growing, aggregate demand will be consistently growing. And if aggregate demand is consistently growing and there's a consistent aggregate supply side effect, what do we end up with? With the growth of money, we end up with just growth in prices. So one of the ways in which prices may consistently grow is if money is consistently growing. Okay? Yes? On the side here. theory. It just says the word theory. Yeah, I'm not sure why it's not on the screen there. Yeah. During the break, I'll see if I can just move the screen sideways. Okay, so demand pull inflation. We have an increase in demand. Then we have a supply side response. Right? Then if we have a further increase in demand with another supply side response and a further increase in demand with another supply side response, we just end up with inflation, which begins with the shift in aggregate demand. So it's a demand side process. It's driven by increases in demand. What would be happening here? Obviously, we see output first increasing, so output increases, then it decreases. So obviously we can see that if output is first increasing and then decreasing, we're going to have a cyclical effect, right? Output going up and then coming down. And then aggregate demand increases, output goes up, and then supply shifts to the left and output goes down. Goes up, goes down, up, down. And the whole time we're just getting inflation. Alternatively, we could have cost push inflation. This is our second type of inflation process. We're now referring to inflation that arises from the supply side. In other words, it is kicked off by an increase in the costs of producing. What are the two main sources of cost increases? Well, either the cost of our labor, so if we have a change in the money wage rate, so employees go to a bargaining council and they demand a higher wage, or alternatively, any of the other inputs that an employer uses in a production process. So the price of any other, we've got here raw materials, but essentially any other inputs. Oops. Any other inputs. So either labor or any other inputs. So the price of any of those costs of production increases. What does that mean? It means at any given price level we will be supplying less, or alternatively, to supply the same quantity we will need a higher price as the producer. If our costs of producing are increasing, it means to sell the quantity we were previously producing, we would require a higher price. So our short-run aggregate supply curve is shifting to the left. What happens with that increase in the price level? So that increase in costs leads to an increase in price level. Our initial equilibrium point, compare our initial equilibrium point to the decrease in supply. Obviously, the quantity supplied will be less than the quantity demanded at the initial equilibrium price. So what happens? Upward pressure on prices. As prices increase, we move upwards to the right along our new short-run aggregate supply curve, and we move upwards to the left along our aggregate demand curve. As prices increase, it brings us to a new point of equilibrium where our new aggregate supply curve intersects our aggregate demand curve. We have a lower level of output and higher prices. What is the response to these high prices? Well, if there's an aggregate demand response, then essentially higher prices might increase aggregate demand. How might it increase aggregate demand? Remember from our previous slide, we saw that obviously if we increase money, right? If we print money, if we change the quantity of money in the economy, that increases aggregate demand. So as our price level rises, there might be a demand side response which says, well, let's go out and borrow more money in order to purchase more things. Alternatively, there could be any other kind of intervention at that higher price level which says, right, let's increase aggregate demand. What kind of intervention could we have? Well, with lower output, okay, and lower equilibrium output, government could say, we're not happy, we've entered into a recession, we'd like to try and counteract this recession. How do we counteract this recession? We could, for example, if we are the Reserve Bank, print money, which would then generate demand. Alternatively, government could increase spending. Okay? An increase in government spending would shift aggregate demand. Alternatively, government could say, right, we're going to decrease taxes. We're in a recession, we're going to decrease taxes to promote consumption spending, investment spending, shifts aggregate demand to the right. Okay? So in response to those higher prices and lower output, we could have a shift in aggregate demand to the right. What do we end up with? Well, we're at our same level of output, but with higher prices. But what kicked off this increase in prices? It was an increase in the costs of production. In other words, this was supply-side generated inflation. Okay? If that increase in aggregate demand leads to further higher prices, and as a result, laborers demand higher nominal wages, what's going to happen? Our aggregate supply curve will shift to the left again. If in response to that aggregate supply curve shifting to the left again, government intervenes once more and shifts aggregate demand to the right, what do we end up with? Consistent inflation with output falling and then increasing, and then falling and then increasing, and falling and increasing. So we don't end up with any growth, but we end up with inflation, and we end up with a cyclical output. Okay? Except our cyclical output in this instance is always below our full employment. So we're always in a kind of a depressed economic situation. So this is a cost push inflation process, and a cost push inflation process is characterized by a combination of rising price level and decreasing GDP. So our prices are going up, but our GDP is consistently below full employment. And that is something problematic called stagflation. When you enter a recession and you have consistently rising high prices. Stagflation is particularly problematic for people that are poor and unemployed. If you're poor and unemployed, what you end up with is fewer job opportunities, so less chance of actually getting employed. But at the same time, you have rising price levels. So whatever savings you might have are now buying less. Whatever government grants you might be receiving are buying you less. And you have no way of countering this because you can't go and argue for a higher wage because you're not employed. So whatever you have is now buying less. So who are the people most likely to be affected by stagflation? Unemployed, and particularly poor people. What are the sorts of things that can arise? So what generates then a kind of a stagflation process? Well, when we have an increase in the costs of production. Think about the South African context. What could prompt an increase in the costs of production? Well, say your input costs, like the cost of oil, increases, right? Or say your costs of borrowing increase. As an employer or as a company producing things, you are almost certainly borrowing funds. If the costs of borrowing those funds are increasing, it means you're going to borrow less, which means you're going to have less opportunity to grow. Okay? What would increase the costs of borrowing? Obviously, if our interest rates increase, that would increase the cost of borrowing. Yeah? You with me? What about if we are using oil? Excuse me. What happens if we're using oil and we're importing oil and our exchange rate depreciates, then the cost of oil is going to go up, which means our costs of producing, in other words, transporting anything that we transport, those costs will go up. If we use any kind of oil derivative as an energy source in the production, then that goes up, the cost of energy going up. And if we think now about our current situation in South Africa, we recently had some political decisions that didn't make much sense politically, but economically even less sense. What were the results of our finance minister being fired? We were downgraded, which raised our interest rates. The raising of our interest rates and the downgrading meant that international investors who hold portfolios of South African bond assets had to withdraw. That withdrawal of funding led to depreciation of the rand. Depreciation of the rand increases the costs of any kind of imported inputs. We import oil. Oil is a big part of our production process. It also impacts on, for example, us as employees transporting ourselves to and from work and the costs of just living generally, right? Which means we're likely to demand higher wages to compensate. Higher wages, higher interest rates, depreciation of the economy, meaning higher costs of inputs because we import a lot of our inputs, means shift to the left of aggregate supply. Shift to the left in aggregate supply means lower levels of output, higher levels of inflation. Therefore, the argument goes from government, this is a problem that affects rich white people primarily. Okay, it does indeed affect rich people, but rich people, and especially people that are employed, have a way of dealing with it. Poor people do not. So whilst our political rhetoric at this moment is any disagreement with the current political events is essentially a rich person's concern. Yeah, it is the concern of rich people indeed, but there's an even bigger problem if you're poor, because there's not much you can do about this. All you're going to end up with is higher cost of living and no way of dealing with it. So if anyone wants to have a debate about what the impact of this entire fiasco is, here's a simple ASAD model in which we can demonstrate that really this is about every person in the economy. This is not about rich or poor or white or black. This is about everyone. But specifically, if you are poor, you have very tough times ahead. And in fact, our economy is going to have very tough times ahead because we're likely to enter into a situation where we have high inflation and low growth. Thankfully, you guys are only first or second year, so you've got another, let's say, 2 years before you have to enter into this economy and try and sell your labor. If you are entering into that economy now, yeah, I feel for you. Problems ahead. Okay, so just we've spoken about cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. Any questions or anything you want to chat about at this point? No? Okay. What about expectations? Well, if inflation is expected, then fluctuations in real GDP that accompany demand pull and cost push inflation do not occur. Instead, inflation proceeds as it does in the long run, with real GDP equal to potential GDP and unemployment at its natural rate. In other words, let's say that we've just had a situation in our economy where the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left, almost certainly, right? If, as employees, we know that this is going to happen, our suspicion might be the following. Well, we know this is happening. What is government likely to do in response? There's not much government can do except increase money supply or increase government spending. It's unlikely that they're going to be able to increase money supply. They have not yet captured the Reserve Bank. What they have captured, however, is Treasury. So if you're going to have anything, you're going to have a demand-side response. If we have a demand-side response, what's likely to happen? Prices are going to increase. If we expect inflation to happen, what are we going to do next time we go to bargain for our wages? We're going to ask for higher nominal wages, which is going to shift our aggregate supply curve to the left once again. And if we know that we're going to ask for higher wages, and the government knows that we know that we're going to ask for higher wages, what are they going to have to do in response? They're going to have to increase government spending. And increase in government spending, so now we've got this demand curve shifting to the right, is going to lead to further inflation. If that's leading to further inflation, what do you think we're going to do next time we come to our bargaining council? We're going to ask for higher wages. So ultimately, if we expect inflation to happen, we just ask for higher wages, inflation actually happens, right? And we don't actually really end up moving from our full employment level. We move a little bit and back and a little bit back. In other words, we're always pretty much at full employment, and all we end up with is rising inflation. So, how do we build these expectations? How do we come to some expected level? Well, obviously we need to anticipate inflation, and the way we anticipate it is by forecasting it. And so you will consistently or continuously hear people talking about what they expect inflation to be, and wage negotiations will always take place in terms of expected inflation, and expected inflation will always involve forecasts. So if you listen to the radio or the news or whatever, and you hear labor unions at a bargaining council saying, we demand 12% rise in wages, the argument will always be, well, we expect inflation to be X, whatever it is, and therefore we want wages to be this amount, to take into account that increase in inflation. When the inflation forecast is correct, the economy operates at full employment. If aggregate demand grows faster than expected, then real GDP will rise above potential GDP. If the inflation rate exceeds its expected rate, then the economy behaves like it does in a demand pull inflation situation. If aggregate demand grows more slowly than expected, then real GDP falls below potential GDP and inflation rate slows. How does that happen? Right? Let's draw it quickly. So we've got our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model of the economy, plotting prices against output. Sorry, that was ridiculous. Okay, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And let's say they're at equilibrium, at a position of long run equilibrium. Okay. So let's look at follow those two statements. There's going to be an inflation forecast. Okay, so if there's an inflation forecast, what is it saying? Aggregate supply, there's an inflation forecast, people are expecting inflation, so they demand higher wages. Okay, so they increase their wages, expecting inflation to increase. Why would they expect inflation to increase? Because they expect maybe demand to increase. Okay, so there's an expected demand increase, and in response, there is a increase in money wages, which shifts aggregate supply to the left. If aggregate demand increases by the amount that employees expected, then our aggregate supply curve will shift to the left by an amount to counter that, and we never leave full employment, right? So that, in this situation, what we've just drawn here, this is where expectations, right? Inflation expectations are correct. Okay? Our expectations are correct. So we are always at full employment. Alternatively, what happens when, if we continue reading the statement, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So when inflation forecast is correct, the economy operates at full employment. If aggregate demand grows faster than expected, real GDP rises above potential GDP, inflation rate exceeds the expected rate. Okay, let's see how that might happen. So remember, aggregate supply is going to shift to the left because employees expect prices to rise. They expect aggregate demand to shift to the right. They expect it to shift by some amount, so they shift their aggregate supply to the left. In other words, they expect prices to increase to this level. Okay? But in fact, aggregate demand shifts further than they expected. What do we end up with? Prices are higher than what was expected because demand increased by more than what people anticipated, and we have an increase in output. Our equilibrium level of output increases from from Y0 to Y1. Our prices increase from P0, and instead of increasing to the price that was expected, the prices have actually increased to higher than that, to P1. Okay? In other words, when inflation is greater than anticipated, because aggregate demand has shifted by more than what people expected, what happens? If aggregate demand grows faster than expected, real GDP rises above potential. Real GDP rises above potential. The inflation rate exceeds its expected rate, right? Prices have gone up by more than what people anticipated. People anticipated prices to go up from P0 to PE. This is what was expected. That expected increase in prices shifted the aggregate supply curve. Okay? But that shift was not enough to deal with the total increase in prices. Therefore, the economy behaves like it does in demand pull inflation. That's right, because we've got now demand shifting further than what we anticipated, so we're ending up with output being greater than our full employment level, and because output is greater, prices have risen, and now this kicks off demand pull inflation, right? Demand is increasing, and now there must be a supply side response. Alternatively, if the economy grows slower than expected, real GDP falls below potential and the inflation rate slows. So, what I'm going to ask you to do is essentially draw an aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, okay, and show what happens when aggregate demand does not shift by the same amount as what was expected. Okay, so aggregate supply is going to shift to the left with anticipated increase in prices because there's an anticipated increase in aggregate demand. But what we find is that aggregate demand doesn't shift as much as what employees expected, right? In other words, our money wage rate rises by more than what the actual inflation rate is. In other words, it rises by more than what the price level increase is actually. Okay? Let's draw that. So I will plot the original diagram that you must work off. It's the ASAD model, plotting price against output. We've got a short run aggregate supply curve, and we've got a long run aggregate supply curve. Now there's expected inflation, but expected inflation is going to be greater than actual inflation. So what we're drawing here is a situation where expected inflation is greater than actual inflation. Okay, there seems to be a general understanding of what's going on, so that's cool. So remember, aggregate supply, we've got some expected inflation. So employees expect prices to rise. So they're going to shift their aggregate supply curve to the left. Sorry, they're not going to shift their supply curve. What I mean is the supply curve will shift to the left because they are asking for higher wages, right? They expect prices to rise, so they go to the bargaining table, say we want higher wages, which means our aggregate supply curve is shifting to the left. There's an expectation if we're shifting our supply curve, we expect prices to increase by some amount. Let me just actually redraw that, make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so we're shifting our aggregate supply curve from aggregate supply curve 0, AS1. Our current prices are P0, and we expect some price level PE. We expect in prices to increase by the difference between PE and P0. So here's what we expect prices to change by. In other words, implicit is the assumption that aggregate demand will shift by this amount. Okay, that's the expected change in aggregate demand. So we expect AD to shift from AD0 to AD expected. Okay? Instead of that, however, what do we end up with? Aggregate demand maybe increases by less than what we expected. Aggregate demand increases by less. What happens? Prices rise by less than what we anticipated. So prices increase from P0 to P1. Okay? What do we end up with? Well, we've got inflation, prices have increased, but we've also got a decrease in output. Our output has decreased from Y0 to Y1. Okay? We've got an increase in prices with a decrease in output. That is how we would characterize something like stagflation. So stagflation means stagnant growth. That's the stag part of it. Stagnant growth with inflation. Stagflation. Okay? Everyone happy with that? Okay? So the previous, So our previous example here, we had where expected inflation was essentially less than actual inflation. Expected inflation less than actual inflation. Here we've got expected inflation greater than actual inflation. And our first example was where inflation expectations are correct. In other words, expected inflation equals actual inflation. So expected equal to actual. Okay, so the statement here was if aggregate demand grows more slowly than expected, real GDP falls below potential GDP and inflation rate slows. Okay? So what happens? We've got inflation, but it's not as high as what was expected, so we have decrease in output. Demand grows more slowly than expected, real GDP falls, below potential GDP, and inflation rate slows. So we've still got inflation, but it's less than what was expected. Okay. We've clearly therefore got a relationship between our expectations of inflation and the level of output. Right? What our diagrams here are showing is that if our expectations of inflation correspond to reality, we will always be at full employment. However, if our expectations differ from reality, and if we underestimate inflation, we can actually increase employment. If we overestimate inflation, we decrease employment, right? But here's the interesting thing. This suggests, this diagram here, that if we want to increase employment, we have a trade-off to make because we're going to increase prices. So there's a trade-off between inflation and growth. Okay. And this slide is not changing for some reason. Okay. So what then is the relationship between inflation and either, well, employment or unemployment? Okay. In other words, if we increase employment, we are decreasing unemployment. Right? So what we have is something called the Phillips Curve. What is the Phillips Curve? It's just an alternative to the ASAD model. So it's similar to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. But what it focuses on is the trade-off, and it's a short-run trade-off, between inflation and real economic activity, in other words, output or employment. Yeah.